Flawed assumptions regarding FCC, the Federal Communication Commission in the United States, and ICNIRP, International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection Exposure Limits for Radiofrequency Radiation. Brought to you by ICBE EMF, International Commission on the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields, October 2022. Scientific evidence invalidates health assumptions underlying the FCC and ICNIRP exposure limit determinations for radiofrequency radiation, implications for 5G. In the late 1990s, the FCC and ICNIRP adopted radiofrequency radiation exposure limits to protect the public and workers from adverse effects of radiofrequency radiation. These limits were based on results from behavioral studies conducted in the 1980s involving 40 to 60-minute exposures in 5 monkeys and 8 rats, and then applying arbitrary safety factors to an apparent threshold specific absorption rate, SAR, of 4 watts per kilogram. The limits were also based on 2 major assumptions. Any biological effects were due to excessive tissue heating, and no effects would occur below the putative threshold SAR, as well as 12 assumptions that were not specified by either the FCC or ICNIRP. In this paper, we show how the past 25 years of extensive research on radiofrequency radiation demonstrates that the assumptions underlying the FCC's and ICNIRP's exposure limits are invalid and continue to present a public health harm. Adverse effects observed at exposures below the assumed threshold SAR include non-thermal induction of reactive oxygen species, DNA damage, cardiomyopathy, carcinogenicity, sperm damage, and neurological effects including electromagnetic hypersensitivity. Also, multiple human studies have found statistically significant associations between radiofrequency radiation exposure and increased brain and thyroid cancer risk. In 2020, in light of the body of evidence reviewed in this article, the FCC and ICNIRP reaffirmed the same limits that were established in the 1990s. Consequently, these exposure limits, which are based on false assumptions, do not adequately protect workers, children, hypersensitive individuals, and the general population from short-term or long-term radiofrequency radiation exposures. Thus, urgently needed are health protective exposure limits for humans and the environment. These limits must be based on scientific evidence rather than on erroneous assumptions, especially given the increasing worldwide exposure of people and the environment to radiofrequency radiation, including novel forms of radiation from 5G telecommunications for which there are no adequate health effects studies. These are the authors of the paper. They come from Slovakia, the United States, Turkey, Brazil, Sweden, Canada, Finland, the United Kingdom, Australia, China, and the Ukraine. Radiofrequency limits based on specific absorption rate. The FCC and ICNIRP relied on acute exposure that lasted between 40 and 60 minutes, behavioral studies in small groups of animals consisting of 8 rats and 5 monkeys performed in the 1980s to establish exposure limits for radiofrequency radiation. The numbers in square brackets refer to references in the paper. FCC and ICNIRP base these limits on 2 major assumptions. Biological effects were due to excessive tissue heating, and no effect would occur below the thermal threshold. 12 additional assumptions not specified by FCC or ICNIRP are discussed in this presentation. We maintain that these studies and the subsequent limits are inadequate to protect humans and wildlife against acute or chronic exposure. Countries that rely on FCC ICNIRP limits are not protecting their citizens or the environment. Children, pregnant women, and those with electrohypersensitivity are particularly vulnerable. This presentation exposes 14 flawed assumptions and counters them with peer-reviewed scientific studies that number in the thousands. These are the 14 flawed assumptions on radio frequency limits made by the FCC and ICNIRP. Number 1. Threshold for any adverse health effects caused by whole body exposure to radio frequency radiation, 100 kilohertz to 6 gigahertz, occurs above a specific absorption rate of 4 watts per kilogram. Any adverse effects above the SAR threshold are due to tissue heating, and no adverse effects are possible to occur below this thermal threshold. Radio frequency radiation is incapable of causing DNA damage other than by heating. There is no mechanism for non-thermal DNA damage. Number 3. 2 to 7 exposures to radio frequency radiation for up to 1 hour duration are sufficient to exclude adverse effects for any duration of exposure, including chronic exposures. Number 4. No additional effects would occur from radio frequency radiation with co-exposure to other environmental agents. Number 5. Health effects are dependent only on the SAR value. Carrier wave modulation, frequency, pulsing, or polarization do not matter except as they influence the SAR. Number 6. The multiple human studies that find associations between exposure to mobile phone radio frequency radiation and increases in brain cancer risk are flawed because of biases in the published case control studies, and because brain cancer rates have remained steady since the time that use of wireless communication devices became widespread. There are no differences among individuals, including children, in the absorption of radio frequency electromagnetic fields and susceptibility to this radiation. Number 8. There are no differences among individuals in their sensitivity to radio frequency radiation-induced health effects. Number 9. A 50-fold safety factor for whole body exposure to radio frequency radiation is adequate for protecting the general population to any health risk from radio frequency radiation. Number 10. A 10-fold safety factor for whole body exposure to radio frequency radiation is adequate for protecting workers to any health risks of radio frequency radiation. Number 11. Exposure of any 1 gram of cube-shaped tissue up to 1.6 watts per kilogram or 10 grams of cube-shaped tissue up to 2 watts per kilogram, duration not specified, will not increase the risk of that tissue to any toxic or carcinogenic effects in the general population. Exposure of any 1 gram of cube-shaped tissue up to 8 watts per kilogram or 10 grams of cube-shaped tissue up to 10 watts per kilogram, duration not specified, will not increase the risk of that tissue to any toxic or carcinogenic effects in workers. There is no concern for environmental effects of radio frequency radiation or for effects on wildlife, pets, farm animals, or plants. And number 14, no health effects data are needed for exposures to 5G. Safety is assumed because penetration is limited to the skin with minimal body penetration. Now, some of these assumptions are simply wrong. They're based on inadequate testing procedures. Some are ignored. And the safety factor is arbitrary. And finally, 5G is untested, yet it's assumed to be safe. Now, the International Commission on the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields, ICBE-EMF, challenges FCC's and ICNIRP's 14 flawed assumptions regarding radio frequency radiation exposure limits. This is what we believe to be true. Number 1, 4 watts per kilogram is not an adequate limit to prevent harm, since adverse health effects have been documented at levels well below this thermal limit. Number 2, ionizing radiation is the wrong model for non-ionizing radiation bioeffects, since ionizing radiation has a direct effect, while non-ionizing radiation has an indirect effect on DNA. Number 3, FCC ICNIRP limits do not protect against chronic exposure, since they did not test chronic exposure with long-term studies. Number 4, FCC and ICNIRP ignore interactions with environmental agents despite studies showing synergistic effects which are more than additive with various carcinogens, mutagens, and inflammatory agents. Number 5, FCC and ICNIRP ignore wave characteristics by focusing exclusively on SAR, despite the fact that these wave characteristics are bioactive. Number 6, statement that brain tumors are not increasing is false, because glioblastoma multiforme incidence is increasing in the United Kingdom and the United States since 1990s, which agrees with case control experiments showing greatest risk is for ipsilateral tumors. These are tumors on the same side of the head that people hold to the cell phone, and in the cerebellum and frontal and temporal lobes of the brain. Number 7, FCC ICNIRP ignore differences in radiofrequency absorption, despite the fact that children absorb more radiofrequency than adults, since they have a thinner skull, a smaller head, more conductive brain tissue, and are still growing and developing. Number 8, FCC and ICNIRP ignore individual sensitivities, despite the fact that children, pregnant women, and those with electrohypersensitivity are more vulnerable to most environmental pollutants, including radiofrequency radiation. Number 9, a 50-fold safety factor for whole body exposure to radiofrequency radiation is inadequate to protect the public. A more appropriate safety factor based on toxicology should be between 300 and 1,000-fold lower than the threshold guideline. Number 10, a 10-fold safety factor for whole body exposure to radiofrequency radiation is inadequate to protect workers who have not been informed of the real health risks, since neither the FCC or ICNIRP believe that there are health effects below their thermal limit. Number 11, the larger the tissue, 1 gram versus 10 grams, and the higher the frequency, the less reliable the specific absorption rate for localized effects. Tissue size is too large for documenting effects at the cellular level, and SAR is an inappropriate metric above 6 gigahertz. Number 12, item 11 refers to the general population, and item 12 refers to workers. Workers are not informed of health risks. 13, FCC ICNIRP ignore environmental effects of radiofrequency radiation, in contrast to numerous studies documenting electromagnetic field interferences with orientation, migration, food finding, mating, nest and den building animals. Plants are also adversely affected by radiofrequency radiation. And finally, number 14, 5G small cells are likely to increase radiofrequency radiation exposure, since many more antennas will be closer to human populations, and since 5G consists of microwaves used in 3G and 4G, which are known to be harmful, and millimeter waves, which have not been tested for safety. Here we have a visual summary of the results. These claims by the Federal Communication and the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection are false. This one's wrong. This one's wrong. Brain tumors are increasing. Absorption does differ, sensitivity does differ, and 5G has been untested, yet it's assumed to be safe. Ionizing radiation is the wrong model for non-ionizing radiation. Environmental effects, synergistic effects, and characteristics of the waveform are ignored. And finally, the safety factors designed for the public and for workers are arbitrary and do not protect against damage. We urgently need to establish safe radio frequency guidelines. For more information, visit www.icbe-emf.org. Thank you.